Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for listening to this very special thread of our season 3 research sprint on creative AI. You may have found this by looking at the rest of our report, kind of exploring all the other different themes that we've been covering, including legal issues, ethical issues, and commercial opportunities and business models around the latest creative AI tools for music. What isn't really covered in any of those threads, but what was a really critical part of the season, and what I'm very excited to dive into in this episode, was how we created more hands-on experiences around the very tools that we were covering in a way such that we could directly engage with our members, introduce a lot of them to creative AI tools for the first time in a kind of friendlier, safer, more focused environment, and also come across some interesting takeaways and learnings in the process around community design and trying to build a very fun, collaborative research experience around such a fast-moving, fast-evolving technology as creative AI. And with that, I am very thrilled to be joined by our tech lead at Water Music, Alex Flores, who joined the team just over a year ago and who's been the main technical brainchild behind everything that's been happening around the season, from fact checking all of our AI articles that go out from a technical standpoint to helping to build lots of different tools around creative AI that we'll dive into in this episode. Alex, thank you so much for joining.
Yeah, thanks.
As a matter of introduction, would love for you to talk through how you first came across water music, the scope of things you're working on right now within the community and the org.
Oof, I feel like you could fill a whole hour with that. Just context of what we're doing. How I came across water music, I think this was pretty early on in the pandemic and everything had just kind of switched online. I remember wanting to aggregate online events because I was just getting really annoyed having to jump through a bunch of different places to keep up with. And randomly, somebody on my Twitter feed had retweeted your database that was already basically doing this. And I was like, oh, cool. So started following you then. And then it wasn't until one of my artist friends was like, "Oh, hey, how do I like keep in touch with my artists? What are different ways to engage?" And I remember you had posted one infographic that was like really good of all the different platforms that people were exploring. And so I was like, all right, I feel like this is the place where all this info is, and we should probably just jump in and see what's going on there. And so joined with my buddy. He ended up trailing off, but the community for me was interesting enough that I stuck around. I think right now my main focus is on contextualizing all the information that we're generating inside the community and making it more approachable and like how do I describe it? We're definitely leveraging a lot of ML models or like experimenting with them to try and extract information from just like the raw content that we've been generating. But then also realizing that a lot of the value of the information, even if we have it in some like central database, is not easily accessible or at least put into context when the people most use it. And so mapping out how we can do that. A lot of explorations around language models and natural language processing and a bunch of really deep niche topics as far as parsing chats and like segregating out different conversation topics that are overlapping. It gets pretty interesting. What else are we doing? I feel like we're doing a lot.
We are doing a lot, always. I mean, you were just getting into this now, but a lot of Discord stuff, just trying to figure out how to make conversations easier to navigate, synthesize that with our articles, as you mentioned.
Oh yeah, that's like the big dreaded. I feel like every DAO's is dealing with this right now. How many times have I heard, "Oh, I hate Discord," but like, where are we gonna go? And so trying to wrangle some sort of interface that makes it more approachable and synthesizes. There's a bunch of references for this in academia. So this guy I follow on Twitter called Max, and he had this really interesting paper called Chatting with Glue. I remember that was like a big inspiration for a lot of people in that community as far as like different ways you could have a conversation and then extract information from it, a more rich dialogue. And then that paired with some other things I saw through like Microsoft research of how you have community summarize different segments of conversation so that you can dive in as deep as you have time for, as deep as you want to go, but still have the connections and references that are happening. I think that specific vision, a lot of things that have been tried kind of falls when you need a lot of human input to drive that synthesis. But now with language models, I think it gets a lot more interesting to iterate on those ideas again.
Yeah. Yeah, actually a lot of ways that both of us and also a lot of people on our research team for season 3 were already using AI tools and getting hands-on for specifically for information synthesis and not just for music, which I definitely want to touch upon later. Before that, I guess as a way to now segue specifically into thinking about creative AI. I think what's been really great about having you involved in this season, not just on the technical support or development side, but also on the deep research and kind of context setting side, is that you were super early to pick up on a lot of creative AI developments, especially those that were happening in the visual art and text worlds. On the music side, I think that was like definitely newer to all of us. But just thinking with your background going into the season, did you have any personal goals or hypotheses or just things you wanted to learn more about in terms of music specifically, especially comparing it to other domains that you might have been more familiar with?
Music specifically, I would say I'm a lot less familiar with the raw information, like representation of AI. I don't think we ever got into those technical details as part of our like output, but it's pretty easy to grok like what how to process an image and like how do you build a model around like streams of pixels. But audio, it seems a lot different in a way that I actually didn't know coming in. Was it more complicated or less complicated? Intuitively, you want to say more because there's a lot more information. There's a lot like the space. Like if you're talking about a pixel, it's like 0 to 255 times 3 for RGB, and so there's a fixed amount of information that can be captured in a pixel. But for a moment of audio, there's a lot of frequency, like hertz frequencies, but that can be compressed and then re-upscaled. And then also there's temporal consistency. So like music isn't going to change super drastically from one frame to another. There's something you can compress across time too. So on that side, I was curious to just kind of dive in more in like focus mode to figure out what was going on there. The ethics conversations on music and the rights, especially the rights, I was really curious to learn how companies are approaching it because I feel like music as an industry also has a lot more infrastructure built up around that. And so the clash is going to be a bit more drastic.
When you say infrastructure, you mean like legal infrastructure, like copyright, detection, claiming, all that stuff?
Yeah, but we also have more unified infrastructure like PROs and just like how do you collect rights and like compulsory rights already getting assigned to different orgs that track this stuff. There's a whole institution around managing rights in music that I feel like most other industries don't have.
Yeah, certainly not in visual, which is like more of kind of a free for all. Was there anything that you learned throughout the process that surprised you or was unexpected in terms of how the music AI landscape has been evolving or kind of what defines it?
To be completely honest, not really. I was a little surprised at how long it took audio to pick up compared to visual. But then again, if you really think about it, it's not that surprising as far as like availability of data and desire, I guess. This gets into something we've talked about before is like people's need to have music versus like need to generate art or need to generate text on their own. Needing to generate your own music is a lot less necessary for the average person. We already have like a glut of music content out there that's very easily accessible. You can find the music that serves your current need relatively easy, but to generate visuals or text, that's a lot harder. There's a lot more direct need for people. So in that sense, I understand why music is behind, although it is just starting to catch up with these music LM and music OEM models. So that's going to be pretty exciting. I feel like a lot of our big revelations are about to come once people start bolting different things to these base models. That's when I think it'll get interesting.
Especially with what you've been following in like the visual and like text slash language model worlds. Both of those worlds are also going through their own respective revelations right now, whether that's new paradigms of accessing information or tooling, also lawsuits, of course, with the various lawsuits against stability recently. Even though big revelations in music AI are still yet to come, are there any kind of critical changes or paradigm shifts you've seen from other domains that might be worth considering or kind of preparing for in the music world?
Actually, what's the project that just came out yesterday? It's like Open Assistant. I feel like that is something I've been like a drama I've been bidding for like the music side of things. Okay, let me step back. I think a lot of the existential fear that comes from artists is having their work used to train an AI that generates music instead of that. And the low hanging solution is like, all right, well, I'll consent to the data if it's going to happen anyway, but give me a portion of the revenue that comes from using this model. And so people are already iterating on the ideas of having licensed models and remunerating the people that help contribute to the output. I don't know how the pooling would work or whatever, but like the concept's there. But I was saying for a while that usually what will happen from the builders is if there's any kind of friction, they'll build around it. Unless you have brand value to the point to where like you can sell a splice pack on your own based off of your brand, I feel like that won't work. I feel like the community, there's a lot of smart people. Like making music isn't exclusive to people that have made it in the music industry. It's everything else around that path in a career that kind of makes it exclusive. But you have a lot of smart people that are programmers, that are researchers, or that have friends that will have a desire. It's like, hey, look, we want an open model so that we have no restrictions and we won't have to pay licensing for all these experiments that we're going to have to run thousands, millions of times. And so we'll come together as a community to generate these models. And that's already happening on the tech side. So you have this project called Open Assistant where they're basically trying to recreate ChatGPT. And specifically, one of the parts that really unlocked ChatGPT was this sub AI that they made that helped. They got humans to label and generate responses and interactions and rank them. And then they took that and made an AI to like bootstrap itself. And so there's an open project right now to build that specific part of ChatGPT that'll help build a bigger model. So I feel like it happens without fail. Like so many times I've seen it where it's like, all right, let's monetize in this way. And then the community will come up together and be like, all right, well, can we make an open version that just walks around this? Because our needs to scale and like our needs to experiment are going to be limited by having to go through like this checkpoint.
I guess this has happened throughout music tech history. This dynamic is not anything new of like a company, say a rights holder or trade org, kind of imposing restrictions or like ring fencing usage of music or licensing of music online, and people just finding ways to work around them because they're fans or they're passionate about like an open music culture and they're gonna find whatever means necessary to promote that. Is that kind of what you're saying? Like setting expectations of certain kinds of restrictions are not gonna be as effective as you might think. Like,
That last sentence specifically of certain restrictions not being as effective as you think, I think hits it. There's like a subtle nuance on like two different things we could be talking about. It's not about like old piracy days of like, oh, I like this song, let me just pirate it because I don't want to buy the CD. It's more like in the AI generative space, being able to even make a base model that has the functionality to do a bunch of things, whether it's like input text and generate music or input a photo and generate music or style transfer between two different songs. Like that core piece of code and core piece of that model, a core piece of technology doesn't have to be styled for any specific artist. This is different from ripping an artist's song because you're a fan. This is more about generating an artist agnostic model that is just like foundational to generating anything. And so I think a lot of people in the music industry were like, oh, we've heard that you need a lot of data to train a good model, and we have the data. And so if we can contribute our data and then get a proportion of the rights, then we'll be fine. But I think the community will eventually, I mean, every piece of software that is expensive, there'll be like an open source version of it because people want to build without that restriction or people taking that cut, just because it does limit how people can experiment or build off each other if they're having a track on. Like the rest of the world doesn't have the music industry infrastructure, and even outside the music industry doesn't have the proper infrastructure to manage this.
yeah, that leads to a more generalized version of what we're talking about. Separately, we've talked about a lot of like misconceptions around what's actually happening with these models. Yeah, I think one of the maybe most notorious recent examples of this was with, I believe, the lawsuit that was filed against Stability and a bunch of other visual AI companies in California. And there was a section in the lawsuit that had a spiral shaped diagram that was meant to represent the distribution of various properties of images in the training data behind one of these models, but it was misinterpreted as like an actual image of a spiral and used like in a completely kind of off the rails way to make an argument that was not related to what the original image was actually trying to convey. And there's a really good anonymous breakdown of a lot of the misconceptions or errors that were in that original lawsuit. As this tech becomes a lot more mainstream, I'm sure, especially because of how powerful it is and how fast it's moving, there'll be a lot of misconceptions about what's actually happening that might lead to like mismatched expectations about what the tech actually can or cannot do. In the worst cases, it could lead to harming certain people, definitely like spreading misinformation, just some things on my mind. Are there any especially common misconceptions that you've seen about how these AI models work, especially thinking for this season and whoever's listening to this episode, which is probably someone working in the music industry and like just getting their feet wet, like past mistakes and understanding this tech that you would like for us to avoid in the future?
Around generative models in general, I think the biggest misconception is that the training data that goes into training a model sits inside the model. Really, what's happening is that there's more abstract representations of that data that gets encoded that sinks into the internal representation of the model, and it's not specifically the image or the song or whatever else that you're putting into it. Now, there are caveats to this. There is a concept called overfitting a model to where like you really hone the internal representation of the model to where like it really only outputs that same piece that you came in, you like put in. And there was actually a recent paper, I think that came out like last week, that showed some researchers were able to reproduce almost exactly some of the training data, but like the percentage is absurd. It's 0.001% or something of all the data that went into the model. And so they're still trying to figure out like how, like why it overfit in that specific area or something. But in general, the data that goes into it isn't encoded inside the model. It's more like these abstract representations, like for images, like what is an edge or like composition and all that stuff. And so it's a lot harder to use your traditional IP arguments. I think one side has an issue of trying to stand on the arguments that have worked before around IP and protecting IP and what's permissible and what's not. And the landscape's completely different as far as like how the media is being generated. But on the other side, I feel like they're taking that argument for face value instead of understanding like what the real problem is. There is a real conversation to be had about artist data being used, whether it was legal or not, like the consent around that, and then the general implications of what happens when these models become like very full fledged, and society as in general is going to have to come to grips with like how we treat this and like is it better or worse? It could be better if it enables a lot more people to express themselves. But yeah, do you just leave it up to natural events happening as far as what's going to happen to how we value art or like how we value making art or what? And then in music specifically, what kind of models would support the current music industry if this reality comes to fruition? Does everything kind of shift more towards like a classical music, like sponsored, subsidized model for people that like want to create art? Or do you accept that anyone can create art and the path to the career in art is like less of a thing and it centers around brands? So there's a lot of things that might go in flux, but that's also speaking more towards like pure art generation, which I feel like in the short term, like maybe 5 years, might not be the biggest way AI disrupts music. I feel like a lot of the disruption is going to come around things that happen around pure audio generation. Like I know Sony has this thing where you can like upscale your audio on your like one of the new Xperia phones, and it sends it to their servers and it processes it. So you don't need to book studio time if you want to have basically studio level quality vocals. So like little things like that, I feel like actually unlock a lot of opportunity, but it doesn't solve the general like supply versus demand issue that I feel like is existential to the music industry right now.
So, follow-up question on overfitting, just like to clarify technically what's happening for people who are listening. So, fine-tuning models on one's own back catalog or sample library as a way for artists to use AI in general. It's like very much in demand. We ran a fine-tuning workshop internally within modern music that was super popular, and I know a lot of like producers are interested in building their own like AI models. Are you saying like even within that context, it's not, oh, the data is like actually incorporated into the model itself? There's like still some abstraction layer that's happening there?
Yeah, I guess to get a little deeper on what fine tuning is, if you can imagine, I feel like this analogy is only going to work for a very small percentage of people, but like in the game show, The Price is Right, there's this game called Plinko. Or I don't know if you've seen those little games where like you have beads that like fall down and hit a bunch of pegs, and then they like kind of bounce around, and you're trying to get it to hit like land in one specific vertical.
Uh huh.
That's kind of how you can think of an AI model. You're dropping in a piece of input data at the top, and then it's hitting a bunch of beads, and then you're kind of trying to guide it towards a specific output. And training the model is just kind of like shifting those pegs around so that it bounces in a way that like still generates some random output because you don't want it to generate the same thing, but you kind of want to guide it to a specific place. And so fine tuning is like taking the last layer, like the thing that touches that ball last, and like really shifting those around to like really guide it to a specific area. But those pegs are not pieces of data, they're like concepts. And so there have been artists that do fine tune their models or fine tune the models on themselves and mess with it. And I've heard that they'll listen back to the output, and it's interesting what abstractions the AI kind of picks up as like their style. And it's not until they hear somebody else try and recreate it, be like, oh yeah, I guess that is something I do. So in that sense, yeah, it's still very much an abstraction. But like I was mentioning before, you can abuse the model, like really hone it in to where it is very much outputting the input data, but it's not because the data is in it directly, but it is encoded very strongly towards it.
Got it. Thank you for that clarification. The second question was the existential question of like where the value is going to be in the music industry once this technology becomes more mainstream. We've asked this of most of the interviews we've done as part of the season, always trying to get people's perspective on the key macroeconomic issues around generative AI at large, looking at things like content oversaturation, wealth inequality being exacerbated through these tools, skill development, unemployment, or kind of job displacement. Those are, I think, a few of the examples that are also top of mind for a lot of people in music who are monitoring these tools. You said specifically the value no longer is in the music itself, but is more in like the brand or the interactions around the artist name or the kind of the community around it. Could you speak to your own mental model for how you're thinking about value accrual or distribution and like how that will look in the future for creative AI at large? Like in a world where the cost of generating these things will be close to zero, if not already at zero from the user perspective, what has value and why?
I feel like it actually hasn't changed. I guess there's different kinds of music and different uses for music, but the music that we typically think of, it's having some sort of emotional connection to the listener. And so like what pieces make up that formula, I feel like still won't drastically change. Fan to artist engagement, any personal connections that people have with like the song or like where they heard it or whatever. If everyone could have a model that generates the music that they perfectly need to hear in that moment, at least the way we imagined it, it wouldn't feel great because there is no shared narrative. That's actually something I just have to give the big capital I music industry credit for is its ability to shape a unifying narrative across a culture. And that I feel like might get lost if people lean too much into generative AI. And I think because of that, it won't come to fruition exactly in the way like people are fearing. Though I do think the fears are very well warranted. I'll get to that in a second. But besides that, we already have an oversupply issue. Go to SoundCloud and you can find great songs. If you know how to navigate SoundCloud, you can find amazing music that has less than 100 plays, less than a dozen plays. So the idea that like artists are going to be drowned out, like it's already like the pipeline to have a successful career depends on certain things that I feel like AI is not going to bring to the table, or at least audio generation. Now you get into like AR avatars and like people having something to interact with that like mimics things of an artist, and that gets a little more iffy. But yeah, things like brand are still going to be very key. Things like overall narrative, things like storytelling, things like context and like what things mean for that. It's a very complex emotional system, and all you're really trying to do when you're like building this song is like communicate some level of emotional connection to somebody else. That's usually what happens whenever you make a song like for someone else. That side of music hasn't been very sustainable for a while, and I think a lot of artists have made their careers work through other types of work that are higher margin. So actually, I got a lot of these thoughts from someone on our team, Young, who makes famous podcast music, and it's really good. And he says that pays the bills for him to make the music that he actually wants to do. Not that he doesn't want to make podcast music, but like there's like different types of music, right? And so the podcast music because it's able to pay his bills means it's very high margin. And so for the people on the other side of that deal, there's a lot of market opportunity for someone to undercut that space. And so that's where the danger I think comes from, is that piece of the pie that is actually supporting the quote unquote like real music that gets generated will get smaller. And so the general concept of how like normal art is going to be generated is going to be interesting. I wouldn't say that's exclusive to music too. I feel like that's a general mental model to have towards AI. Like that was the big question. Is like, oh, everybody's shocked. I mean, I was surprised. Like, why did all the things we said were like AI proof become the main things that were tackled by AI? Creative writing, like art, like all the like big concepts. And I think it comes down to the market opportunity to make that stuff more commodified. There's already models that like can ingest a lot of like medical data, and you can talk to it kind of like an advanced version of WebMD to diagnose and give recommendations. And in a way that like a single doctor, I feel like won't be able to ingest all these new papers that are coming out and all the new information that's coming out in real time. And so there's stuff happening there. There's stuff happening for lawyers, consulting, like all these very expensive, high margin industries, I think, are feeling the most threat because there's the most demand to have that stuff more commodified and accessible. There's just like pure capitalism forces at that point. It's like, where's the biggest opportunity to focus our efforts on?
I think that's been the biggest misconception or like dent in my mental model that I've had to revisit. Or I think a lot of people at large have had to revisit. I think the previous iteration of conversations and public discourse around automation's impact on jobs was very much like low level factory work, truck driving, roles that would stereotypically be considered unskilled. Yeah, but what's driving like my mom learning about ChatGPT, for example, is like reading about people using it to write high school essays that get A's on them. So it's like the point of like impact that people are focusing a lot on now, or where it is actually driving change and paradigm shifts, is like actually at the top layer in terms of perceived value of the work in our current capitalist society, I guess, rather than the lowest level. So yeah, I'm still processing that myself in terms of that being unexpected.
Yeah, I mean, I guess basic like capitalism model is like what is value typically isn't what is hard. It's like how replaceable you are in that system. So like let's say you're a waiter or something. It's a very hard job. Like one of the hardest jobs you could do is if you have a long double shift. I've LA'd. That shit was brutal, like just running constantly. But it's a very replaceable job. Like if you leave, you can find someone else to fill that position. Versus these other jobs where the value, quote unquote, that the system assigns to these other jobs are because it's not easily replaceable. You can't just replace a doctor. You have to do, I don't know how many dozens of years of training, right? And education. So that's kind of where AI is stepping in, is like these things that typically weren't easily replaceable being replaceable. And that's where the big opportunity is.
Especially those kinds of roles like doctors or lawyers go through such a long like educational pipeline to get there. Maybe there's like lack of understanding about the fact that a lot of those kinds of functions is completely replaceable or commodifiable with the right tech. Almost every single lawyer that I've spoken to, like they are so excited for this kind of tech to like really gain hold, because they and their staff and interns, whoever, spend so much of their day to day doing very grunt busy work and like admin work, and they are getting paid a lot of money to do that work. So it'll be interesting to see how the incentives and just like the day to day of being someone like a lawyer or doctor, how those change when you just have the world's knowledge at your fingertips. There's something called BioGPT that's ingested tons of biology papers, and you can just query them and get to findings from papers in like such a short period of time. Just thinking like what I went through also in college in like humanities classes to get to that level of immediate insight, and like how that will just change education in general. Yeah, it's wild to think about. That's definitely another curveball though, or more like a side conversation.
There's a lot of controversy around that too, right? It's like, oh, these models can hallucinate and like hack your information, and like you can't just have this model start saying things. But right now, I think there's a real value in these models being accessible to communities where like that's not even an option. Like very rural communities where like they don't have a doctor. They don't have a doctor that knows a lot of stuff. So even if it's like not the best, it's like leagues better than what they have access to right now. And so like that commodification, I think is going to be very powerful. And so like in music, it kind of comes down to the same thing. I feel like there's a lot of people that like would be able to like grow the music value pie, but it's not viable for them to play that game, especially if we want to wade into the maybe potential future of metaverse, right? So much of those spaces will require music, but I don't know how viable it will be for worlds to be built on like the current licensing model. But for this new reality to start being built, you'll need something that's, yeah, maybe it's not as good as a real artist, but it's something that like we can start building, and like eventually it'll grow the pie for where music could live and like the amount of opportunities there are for music to be valued.
Yeah, I'm thinking of Roblox reaching this huge settlement with the National Music Publishers Association a few years ago. I think they were hit with a $200 billion lawsuit. And as part of the settlement, they removed the ability for users to upload their own music to include in Roblox games, the exception of just a small handful of labels. And like finding information about why that is like very, very hard to find. I don't work at Roblox. I've never worked at Roblox, but if they can like navigate the legal licensing landscape in like a shrewd way, they can absolutely come out the other side with some tool that allows users to AI generate their own music for games, or like have some sort of like AI generated like sound effect framework for whatever game they're building, and have that music be pretty decent quality, such that they don't care if some, you know, insert major label here artist is, if they have their music available. Like, no, I can just make it myself. That would be an interesting and very plausible plot twist, I think.
That kind of leans into like functional music, right? Like this gets back to like where I think value in music is, and like the brand and like the community connections, and like there's a limit to the value of that generated music unless you're creating value around that generated song, right? Like you make this song and now you start building the experience around that specific song and start accruing value to it by its use or by its style that you like come up with, then that would work. But otherwise, it's just going to be like very functional. Yeah, the whole IP argument in music is actually very interesting in general. I remember I had this idea. I won't call out who else had a similar idea, but I'm glad I'm not the only one. There's this obsessive concept of like, oh, this melody is my like this piece of music is like in my style. Like you can't do anything close to it. I'm like gonna pull out a lawsuit against you. And I've always wanted to like get all the music from like all of time and analyze it and just kind of like point out that look, nobody's being original here. It's infringing on everybody if you like really look at it as a whole. And so let's all just move on and start thinking of new models to approach this with.
Easier said than done, of
Oh
course.
yeah.
But
There's
yes.
yeah, I have no idea how you would get that data, the compute to analyze all that. I feel like might not even exist in the world yet. But yeah, it's just a weird argument that we keep coming back to. And it feels a lot. It's probably going to go down not that well, but it feels a lot like the patent trolling system that goes on. I know I'm like more familiar with it because a lot of the courts that they use to run these patent troll cases are in Texas, where I'm at right now. So not the best thing for like Texas. I mean, we have a lot of not great things for our reputation right now, but that's something I am particularly ashamed of. But yeah, it basically comes down to who has enough money to argue that this little plot of land in the IP landscape is theirs, and like that you can't touch it. And I don't know how much of that is grounded on being there.
So much to dive into with like music culture in particular. So already, like the music hit making machine is a factory of, could be dozens of songwriters and producers that like a major label album goes through by the time it hits the proverbial shelves or like streaming services like Spotify. Most people will not know about the people behind the scenes, like the songwriters and producers, like making that factory running. They'll know about the performing artist. There already is a huge gap between like who, I guess, like the huge crews of creators who are making music and writing the music that's going out, and like who's actually getting at least like the public facing recognition for it. Even in that instance, ideally, if like publishers are doing the job, if PROs are doing the job, like those people behind the scenes are still getting royalties. Like they're still hopefully getting checks from those songs getting big. I think what will happen with AI, this may be a cynical way to put it, but I think it's partially true, is that people won't know who wrote it, and the people who wrote it maybe won't get their check anyway, or just like the fundamental like structure of payment and attribution and compensation will just be like completely thrown out of the water and will have to be rethought in terms of like how people share in the value, if there is value around like this music that's generated. Because I think with these AI tools, it'll be increasingly hard to like try to kind of police usage of certain kinds of music in the way that you described.
So are you saying like I who like press a button on an AI model and just what I'm doing is just self-selecting on what sounds good? Like I am the filter for the actual output of the model, but the model is the one that's like generating the music. I don't get like a special label for filtering what's good, and like I'm not going to get compensated as like a quote unquote artist for that. Is that what you're getting at?
I think this goes back to the earlier discussion around training data, because a huge trend that's been happening, I think Billboard had some really good reporting on this in the last few years, of the number of interpolations happening in the Billboard Hot 100 has gone up significantly. It's because of like growing influence from publishers and huge catalog acquisition funds like Hypnosis and other like private equity funds. There's an increasing push for songs that would hit the Billboard Hot 100 to sample previous songs. So it's just like a catalog Ouroboros, like snake eating its tail. Like we're just like stuck in this nostalgia cycle of like songs interpolating like older songs. Like Rogers and Hammerstein claiming 90% of the publishing on this Ariana Grande song, Seven Rings, I think. Like vast majority. So there is this culture of like, okay, if we're sampling this song that got written before, the songwriters who contributed to that kind of like melting pot of references should get compensated. I think the way that AI models work, yeah, going back to earlier discussion about like to what extent the training data is actually incorporated into the model. Yeah, just that is
Yeah,
just
I
not going to
totally what you're
work.
saying. I'm not going to say it's impossible because I know there's a lot of people experimenting around it, but like it's very hard, maybe impossible, to get an output and know exactly every part inside the model that like helped influence that, and that to what percentage. Because you have it's going back to those plinko pegs. Like you have all these pegs that you're shifting around, and like each piece of training data shifts that peg around a little bit, and sometimes it's shifting in the wrong direction. You're having to correct for it. So like how do you even attribute data to like shifting it the wrong direction, and like having other data shifted more towards the correct direction, and like by how much, and like how valuable was that shift, what it looks like to interrogate like an AI model without actually looking at the weights inside or like understanding what's going on. It's kind of like trying to give someone an MRI scan by just talking to them is like kind of where we're at. It's like very hard.
Mm.
And yeah, you just talk to it a lot and give it like a bunch of inputs and see how those inputs affect the outputs, and like change the inputs a little bit and see how the output changes a little bit. Yeah, like it's very, but yeah, that gets into like artists having a model that they give data to that then they request like to get some sort of compensation for. And this gets back to the original point where like, yeah, that might exist. And I think there will be certain brands of music, like certain artists that have enough brand value to where like this just gets into like the Spotify versus torrenting. Like it'll be easier to just use this license model if it's at a reasonable price. People will be like, oh yeah, if you want to like sound like this person, like we just use this model. But outside of that, I think the with 3 to 5 years, people that like are wanting to experiment with music AI are just going to come together and build open models where they don't have to worry about that.
I think the value, my hypothesis, the value of AI generated music will be determined collaboratively by the person who made it and the person who is consuming it, assuming those are different people. They could very well be the same. So, for example, a couple of years ago, I interviewed the CEO of Boomy, Alex Mitchell. Boomy's like one of the quickest to use off the shelf like music AI generation tools. And he's like very open about how a lot of the songs on the platform are not quote unquote good in the traditional sense. Like they're not radio or playlist ready at all, but people still find meaning in them. Like one early use case was for Boomy was like people making diss tracks to use in Discord servers. So like whenever people were in a Discord server and like someone lost a game, they'd send this like very grungy, distorted sounding track from Boomy and would label it some inside joke or something. And these are a bunch of like 12 to 15-year-olds. In the traditional industry framework that has no value or like little or no value, but like in this social context, it does have a lot of value. Like these kids are able to express themselves in ways that They really couldn't before. Those are kind of the two layers I'm understanding. I don't think value can be limited to some arbitrary determination around aesthetics. Like a song that sounds like this is more valuable. It's more like, can the person who made it convince themselves and or other people that it is valuable? And do the people who are consuming that music, assuming they're different from the person who created it, do they believe it? Before diving even deeper into the existential questions around music and AI, definitely want to touch upon some of the work that you did designing experiences for our season 3 research sprint. For people who are listening, just to context set a little bit on the scope of things that we did. So as I mentioned earlier, we had a legal thread, an ethics thread, and a business model thread. The structure of those were pretty similar to their analogous threads for previous seasons. We set up a thread in our Discord server, had a pretty fluid contribution culture. People could tune in and out, lurk on the threads if they wanted to. We would hold weekly calls to kind of manage the project and delegate tasks for the week. And we would also share a ton of resources and links throughout the week asynchronously. So just really building this culture of more collaborative learning that water music is all about. What we did with season 2 that was different from kind of the previous 2 reports we'd put out was also get more hands-on with the platforms we were covering. So in case people didn't see, we had the whole metaverse meetup thread that led to an output kind of analyzing design choices and critiques and limitations around current virtual world platforms in terms of how people could interact with each other and express themselves socially, with the focus on using music to do that. I think it's just a really cool experience that made our research that much better. For season 3, we took that to a whole other level, I think, by having several different layers of interactive experiences around AI tools. We held a series of weekly workshops. They started out as creative challenges, where every week we'd gather and kind of do a walkthrough tutorial and then kind of hands-on office hours around visual AI tools, text AI tools, and then going to music in the last month. And then for music, because the tools are super new, collaborated directly with a lot of the companies building these tools in real time. So we worked with like Harmony, which is building dance diffusion. We worked with Never Before Heard Sounds and Pollinations and brought them in to do kind of like walkthrough tutorials with the community. Those workshops were open to all members, not just to season contributors. So very kind of open, fluid, interactive experience. One very critical part early on of getting people excited about AI in general and like curious about using these tools was integrating a lot of visual and text AI tools into our Discord server, such that people could just like call those models up directly with / commands. So we ended up specifically integrating Midjourney, Stable Diffusion, and various wrappers around GPT-3 into our server. And we have like specific threads. We have a whole forum where you can like try out a challenge, generate crazy lyrics to a song, or generate an image inspired by an album cover. I'm curious from the engineering perspective, as you were building out these bots, especially the custom ones around GPT-3, was there any goal that you had in terms of like how you wanted to design the experience around the bot, or kind of the intended outcomes, especially for people in the water music community who like might not have been as familiar with the tech already?
Oh yeah, totally. A lot of it is just making it as simple as possible. I mean, if you go online, especially like early like art model days, so many of the tutorials were like, oh yeah, go open this collab notebook. And if you've never coded, sure, it's like relatively easy to just like collab notebooks are like a Word document where each paragraph is like code that you can execute. And so you just kind of hit the play button next to each paragraph to execute the code. And you're supposed to just run down the page and just execute everything. It should work. But like Python dependency trees and like things like packages being outdated and like breaking each other, it's a night. And so trying to find a way for people who have no technical experience to have a nice interface to where they can just really just experiment or play around. It's not even making mistakes. It's just poking at what this is and trying to understand what it is. I think that was the biggest like goal, is like just give people time touching the tool to understand what it's capable of and like maybe what it's not capable of. And then also in a space to where they can see other people experimenting. Actually, Midjourney nailed this. I've seen Midjourney get so much shit for like, oh, why is it just on Discord? They were able to iterate on their model a lot and not spent a lot of dev work, right? Like building out this whole other separate like platform where you have to like go and use it. But more than that, I think yeah, I think their model works. Like they have the most, I think 10 million, like the most populous Discord server of all of Discord, which is wild. But what they got for free was public experimentation with people. And so you have no clue, like nobody has coming in, nobody has any idea of like how to even interact with these things. And so being able to see what other people are doing and the results they're getting helps bootstrap newcomers very quickly into understanding what to do and like bouncing ideas off of each other and like riffing off each other. So yeah, trying to like simplify that interface as much as possible was the main goal. So like mid-journey integration, easy enough. Anybody can do it. You just like import it to your own server, private server. The other ones took a little bit more integration as far as these models aren't cheap to run. So GPT, you just query an API and OpenAI is doing all the like compute. We were guided by one of the people from Replicate to integrate their service. So what they provide is GPU hosting for running these models. So I guess I should step back a little bit. On a high level, code has to run somewhere, right? If you're not executing it on your machine, someone's paying to execute it. That's the whole like value prop that like Google gives, right? Like you give us your data, we will give you compute for all your services. AI gets a little trickier because you're not using your traditional form of compute. So you have like CPUs and GPUs, and CPUs are very analogous to like a human brain. They like throw problems at it, it tries to solve it like piece by piece. Like GPUs, it's a graphics processing unit. So they came out of trying to do a video games, right? Like it's too expensive to try and sequentially render an image or a screen inside of a game. And so GPUs are a lot less powerful, but there's like a bunch more of them. So like your average processor right now probably has like 4 cores. Like your average CPU has like 4 pieces of the brain that they can all run things at the same time. Versus your graphics processing unit will have thousands, maybe millions. I don't want to say millions, but for sure thousands to tens of thousands of like little tiny processors. But they're very optimized to only do one thing, which is like matrix multiplication, which is to like manipulate triangles on a screen and like output things. But there's like a lot of limitations of like how GPUs can run and like the way you program for them. So those are a more recent thing to be running in the cloud, like to rent a server somewhere. It's only last couple of years to where it's like semi-viable to do that. But even then, transparently, like I run some of our Discord bots on a $5, $10 a month server that's just using CPU compute. But if you want to do anything with AI, you need this separate kind of graphics card, the GPU that's like very special. And that you can easily get to $20 a day on like the low end. And so finding people that like provide the infrastructure so that you're not having to rent out a GPU for a month when you're not using it 24/7, that's where Replicate kind of came in, is they have the infrastructure to where they're running these models and you can query these models. And then we also explored a banana.dev, which we were close to getting working, but quality wasn't like just the timing didn't work out. But they also have infrastructure where they'll spin up and spin down GPUs on the fly, depending on what your demand is. The cold start times are they were a little too slow for using on a Discord bot. It would take a minute to start up the GPU, but like you can spend way less money than like trying to host your own GPU server. So that was more specific to our generative models that required some compute to happen in somewhere. So like Stable Diffusion specifically, you need to run that model somewhere. OpenAI was just a more direct, like straightforward API integration that anybody could probably figure out how to do. Anybody who has like basic programming knowledge could probably figure out how to do by going through the docs. I iterated a lot on the different interfaces for it because Discord does have a few options as far as like how much like different fields you could provide it and like how much you can abstract away, but it was still very limited. So like you could have an open field where you can input any kind of text and then send that to the back end and then that talks to a GPT. And so I did have one version which was just plain well, hey, you're going to send something to GPT and you have to send it with the prompt and everything, kind of like ChatGPT, and then it'll come back with the response. And then from there, to make it more relevant to the different challenges we were doing, we basically just took that input and would wrap it behind the scenes with a specific prompt that would guide that input towards a specific task. So like one of them was lyric generation. So it's like, oh, let's have 2 different input fields in the Discord bot to where you could put in what kind of genre you want the song and like what topic you want it to be about. And then on the back end, it would take those two inputs and then inject it into a prompt that we iterated on to like where it got decent output, and then it would go send a request, come back. And just on that basic concept of the two different prompts, the two different inputs, there was several iterations just because there's limitations on Discord input. So like you can have your normal standard like slash command input, but they also have this like modal input, which I prefer. But the modal input would not allow for a drop down select menu. So like in the ideal world, it would have been text input for what you want the song to be about, but then like a modal drop down menu for all the different genres that you could have, and like having more parameters. Like if you could specify like, oh, I need lyrics and I need them to be in this pattern, I need this many syllables per line. Like having those kinds of options would have been a lot easier if you could have those kinds of drop down list interactions. Midjourney gets around this in like a more confusing way with like their double dash commands. But yeah, that's fine for people that like have gotten past the initial experimentation phase. But like for people that are coming cold, yeah, having more control over how to communicate with these AI models would have been nice. But just having them in the Discord in general, where people are already at, was pretty key.
I have a follow-up question for you that's not season 3 specific, but it's a more like generalized version of what you were just talking about, which is the interfaces around these models in general. I was more involved in the business model thread, and this was a huge takeaway from that thread, is that with music AI specifically, they're like newer in their evolution compared to visual and text AI, such that the models that are out there, you do still need to know some coding to really be able to work with effectively. And so there's a huge opportunity to just build friendlier UX around audio and music diffusion models in particular. With visual and like text AI tools, there's a lot of preoccupation around the prompts. There's a whole cottage industry around prompt engineering. And I'm curious how it would be friendlier if people didn't have to like write out an entire prompt, but instead could like choose like drop down from some kind of set of preset options, for example. And then if they wanted to customize, they could like add additional layers on top. Do you have any general stance on how the interfaces around like these AI models and tools could improve to make them easier to use, whether that's making prompting easier or just like moving away from that entirely and like having some different interface around it? I don't know if you have any stance on that and where that might go.
Yeah, I mean, just having layers of opinions, I feel would be helpful. Don't be afraid to have an opinion. That's what a drop down menu is, right? It's like, here's my opinion on what are like some good defaults that you should experiment with. But yeah, this gets into like API design, and like good API design or good like abstraction design is have a high level version, but then also have layers that you can dig deeper and get more custom on each layer. So yeah, always having that fallback of just like raw input if you know what you're doing. But then I think we'll have a pretty fun wave of different interaction modes for the media that we're consuming as far as what the AI can do with it. But yeah, not being afraid to have strong opinions on like how to guide people to at least start using it.
I think that just leads to honing in on the specific use case that you're building for. The opinion around what kind of like template or output would be good for like copywriting. So like social marketing copy is very different from like what would be helpful for longer form creative writing. And we're already seeing really interesting differences in tooling around each of those specific use cases. So just like keeping that in mind and
Yeah, I'm
having
realizing now this is actually
yeah.
isn't even like original insight. This is like very basic. Make it easy for your customers to feel good. Because what Instagram did really well, like pre-Facebook, like right early Instagram was like, oh hey, I took this like really shitty 2 pixel image on my BlackBerry, like, or, well, I guess it wasn't BlackBerry, but like really old phones, right, that had horrible cameras, and make it easy for them those pictures to look good through the like act of filtering it. So, or like really good drawing applications. Turns out that they're incredibly simple, and like the way that dynamics, like a lot of engineering work goes into like the dynamics of the brush and like how do you use it so that it looks fluid and like it's not jittery, and so that it's easy for the user to like make good output, and like optimizing that path to where the user has a delightful experience versus like fighting all the different parameters and like all the different things that they could change. But striking a balance to where like you do allow for that change to happen. That's actually like Apple's good at the opinionated design part. They're not good at the letting people change what they want to change about it.
Going back to the workshops that we ran, As I mentioned earlier, we like sequenced the workshops to start with visual art and then go to text and then go to music because that was kind of most to least easily accessible in terms of the ability to play around with those models. And I believe you led the workshop we did on ChatGPT. And I remember that workshop like definitely ran over a little bit of hands-on experimentation, but a lot more just like general existential angst. Like I think one of the prompts like one of the prompts was like generating a template for like a music license or something. Something that we've talked a lot about was like, can you use ChatGPT in a smart way to generate like an actionable like artist strategy and plan? I'm curious whether from that workshop specifically or like in your subsequent explorations in the following months, were there any takeaways for you about that tool specifically in terms of understanding like everyday industry pros relationships with that tech or kind of how the range in which like it could be applied across the industry? Any takeaways there?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the obvious one is that AI is going to hit the industry not through like audio models, but like through these other forms of AI. How much of the industry is built through like human interaction and like negotiation and like reaching out and like cold reach out. And like, I remember I had planned like a bunch of demos, right? Like I was like, all right, I had like pre-cleared these, make sure they like this idea would work in ChatGPT, and then we can demonstrate it to the community and ask questions, get feedback. We can iterate together on these prompts. Towards the middle, like back half of the like structure, I'd set up like, all right, let's import an artist contract that he would sign with like a label, and then ask ChatGPT to highlight any risks associated with this contract for both sides of the party. And someone in the community, like pretty, like I would say, like 10 minutes in, was like, "Oh, yo, can we do this?" Like, it's pretty apparent that there's strong demand for just understanding things and like having a second opinion on all these different documents that you'll have to navigate as you enter the music industry, right? I think, yeah, that seems like the most directly impactful, right? Because yeah, how much of like industry and like everything we do is just centered around communication, and like communication is can be augmented through these like language models now.
So fascinating. Actually, yeah, big takeaway from our survey that we ran, which had 150 plus responses from mostly artists and producers. This was like our general creative AI tooling and ethics survey. The number one use case mentioned was marketing and promotion. It was actually not music creation in terms of like how people are using these tools or would like to use these tools. A lot of the jobs that are like facing the most existential crisis head on are in very documentation, communication heavy work. Like artists just don't want to care that much about social media, and like any tool that can allow them to like spend less time on that and more time doing really interesting like creative work and like manifesting creative ideas on the music side, that is kind of that's still like the core of why they're in the industry. So yeah, with the state at which large language models are at, it's not just the most in demand use case, but like the most plausible to
Sure.
implement right now. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would say even beyond language models, I feel like there's a better word for this, like this trap that like, oh, the goal that we should all be reaching for right now in like the music industry is audio generation. There's so much more to be explored. I mean, I touched on it briefly as far as upscaling audio, right? So that anybody anywhere on a phone can like record vocals or do things that used to require a lot of infrastructure or require like deals so that you could get studio time. That's like one aspect of it, but like so many other things, like I feel like it's known that like a lot of the value, like most of the money that an artist can make is like going on tour or like doing live performance. And I feel like that aspect of like where AI comes in that space hasn't really been talked about as much, which is wild because if that's where most of the money is for these artists, then like why isn't that being like a stronger point of conversation? Like it should be easier to put on a live performance, and if AI is able to commodify different aspects of that, then that will be true. And like especially if you want to like light shows, for example, like there should be a way to where in order to perform to have a decent light show, you have to have like a guy that's running the board and like understanding the venue and the lights that are available there. There should be a way where like the board talks to a controller box that talks to like a camera you put in the middle of the room, have the board sweep every one of the lights across all of its values, like what it can do. The camera can just sense like the capabilities of the room, and then you map a show to that room. And just lowering the barrier. Like if everything centers around like the value of music coming from like an emotional experience, then commodifying everything around it so that it's easier to create those emotional experiences. I feel like
Mm,
that should be like the core framing and like seeing where that can apply throughout the industry versus, oh, let's just create sound. Like that's not super helpful. Or it's a very narrow-sighted view of like how AI can help the industry.
I had one more question just related to some like tooling and experiences around the season. So in the later third or so of the season, we launched something called an AI news bulletin, which had nothing to do with integrating AI as a creative tool into the server, but it was just a new read-only channel where it's mostly you and myself for now who are curating critical AI news as it's coming from Twitter and acting as a filter to make sure that you can go to that bulletin and whatever you read is just like critical things about the landscape that you need to know now if you work in the music and entertainment industries. I guess how we've thought about the filter is like very practical, immediately applicable updates around tools, like new tools that can help a wide range of tasks in the music industry. So we don't just curate audio, we do curate text and visual AI tools a lot of the time, kind of legal updates as they happen, important context on the state of the business. So like certain updates around the number of users for tools will update too. And I know that you, Alex, had worked a lot to set up that bot specifically. So how that channel works is behind the scenes, Alex built a custom Twitter posting slash embed bot, and we use slash command to kind of copy and paste a relevant tweet, decide which channel to point it to, in this case, AI News Bulletin, and then we can add our own curator note, which we do a lot of the time. And the embed itself, I know there's like a ton of back and forth of trying to even get like the formatting of that right, let alone make sure it included whatever information or context like people in our server would need to get the most out of each tweet. Curious if there are any general takeaways for you. Well, I guess two questions for you. One, it's like why, like motivations to build this kind of tool for the community if Twitter already exists and Twitter lists already exist. And then any takeaways from the development perspective in building that out and seeing how people have interacted with it.
Yeah, I mean, initial takeaway just before we jump into the why, Twitter's API is hot garbage. Pay to use it
Yeah, I think
is
you have
going to
to
be
pay to use
interesting.
it now. So thanks, Elon.
Yeah, my
Gonna have
my
to
hope
update it.
is that it's pay to use because they're trying to shut it down and rework it, but that's a big dream.
Wait, your
Why?
dream is that they shut it down? Sorry.
I would love for them to just rework it from scratch.
Okay.
That
And
might require them limiting access and then charging enough to where it's worth it for them to sustain it while they rework it. But if that reworking plan is on the table, I have no idea.
we'll see.
Yeah, the why. I mean, a lot of these look very similar to your normal Twitter embed, but what I noticed with sharing Twitter links is it's usually not enough to communicate the value of something. A lot of times people have to click through it, or even just simple stuff as far as Twitter's link shortener will be linked in Discord instead of the actual URL. And so if that tweet gets deleted, then that link is gone. So the main exercise was actually just kind of recreating Discord's Twitter embed technology. Is how they like you create a bot that makes an embed message and then you format it the right way and hyperlink the right text to the right thing, and like you're extracting that information from the Twitter API. Right now it's mostly a single call. I probably want to rework it to do multiple calls so that the code's cleaner. Because yeah, a lot of the conversations that are worth talking about or like worth highlighting usually incorporate like a quote tweet or something, and like your normal Discord embeds not going to display
Mm.
that. And so the bot was structured to where it would also walk the data structure, embed the quoted tweet, and then also embedding polls was like something that had to be figured out. Funny enough, was using GitHub Copilot. It's very good how good it is at generating code for things that there is a lot of code out there for, right? Like a lot of people write Discord bots, so there's a lot of references and there's a lot of common patterns. And so it was able to like infer from my code, like what I was trying to do. And so sometimes I would just be like, oh, okay, yeah, let's try it out. Let's see what you want to do. Like just like autofill what it was recommending and then go back and tweak it. But yeah, main motivation was to like have a more rich version of a Twitter embed that like properly captures the information that we're trying to share. And then even behind the scenes, the work that went into that is like curating a private Twitter list that we reference that has a bunch of people in the industry and like walking Twitter and like walking the like Twitter suggested and like pulling from my previous like people that I was following and like just compiling this massive list that we could sift through. So there was a decent amount of work there. I do think it'll be interesting if in the future we have enough references of the raw list versus what we're curating from it, and we can build an AI that like will automatically highlight. Maybe not automatically post, but it'll have a suggested to post feed, and then you'll have curators automatically just go in and click to approve. But yeah, the general infrastructure is built so that ideally it's not just Twitter, and we'll be able to highlight specific articles and then also be able to curate messages from the community that get shared inside the server and where you can properly show a reference of who was saying what around that message. So yeah, like right now it's pretty simple but still valuable, which is just Twitter with an augmented version of a Discord embed that provides the context necessary to have a proper understanding of why we were trying to share something. But yeah, hopefully it turns into something a lot more and gives the community tools to help self-curate information, which I think is like very key.
Yeah, very much part of the core ethos since 3 years ago I guess like when the Water Music community and Discord server first launched was like creating a culture of like kind of collaborative curation. I think this AI news bulletin is just the two of us right now, but to your point, people are already sharing Twitter links across a ton of different channels, not just on the AI side, but Web3 remains like the top channel in the server. And Twitter is the main gathering space for that community also, at least publicly. So it's trying to think through cleaner ways to synthesize and represent that and also highlight who those curators are in like a more systematic way.
That's not an easy part. Like even between
Yeah.
us, we've had lengthy discussions on whether something should be curated or not and like why. And I feel like we're usually on the same page about a lot of things as far as what's important. So even though like we work together a lot and have a shared understanding of the world, right? If it's hard for us to come to an agreement, that's a very interesting problem to try and solve on like a community level. So it's been a pretty fun exercise to work with not just the technical level, but like how a community can curate and who gets to have what say.
This is definitely outside of season 3, but very relevant to Water Music is the challenge of scaling voice. And this actually gets to like a kind of closing set of questions or considerations I want to touch on. But just quickly on your last point, I completely agree. It was very necessary, I think, for just the two of us to be the first people to start as the curators and not have it be completely distributed among everyone who's in the season. For example, it took a good like couple weeks to start to establish even like some criteria, like share like consistent criteria that like we kind of knew that was like common knowledge without having to like speak it out loud about what is or is not valuable, what kind of like tone of voice of a given tweet is valuable, like is something too technical versus not. And even adding like 2 more curators into the picture, I think will make that coordination that much more challenging. Coordination around having a shared voice and narrative and perspective on what we're researching has never been easy. I think there's a reason why like editing, especially like large scale collaborative projects, is consistently one of the biggest challenges in our research process, not just because we don't have as many editors as like a smaller group of people, but also because like that work is very hard of trying to align like 10 different people who may have touched a Google Doc around some shared understanding of who we're speaking to and why and what stylistic kind of tendencies to lean towards in writing. It's a lot to coordinate that has a little bit to do with tech, but a lot to do with just like redundant communication and like back and forth. So yeah, like I kind of see a parallel with curation and decentralized and distributed and kind of like self-organized curation being, I think, a really cool goal and a goal that we do have. It does have to be built over time through these like very small scale experiments that allow you to establish a voice from there. Like it can't be a shortcut.
Yeah, language models kind of play an interesting role in all this. It kind of dystopian future I could definitely see happening is where a lot of our speech is parsed through a language model to where so it's like the information we're trying to communicate gets transformed into the most approachable way for the person that we want to listen to it understand. But then that gets into like different ways, like communities, like the social norms within different communities, and like having people be able to step into them fluidly. Like sounds useful, but also kind of dystopian in the fact that nobody's actually speaking to each other; they're speaking through this filter. I could see that being useful for unifying voice, but then also, yeah, it's a weird space to be exploring right now.
Definitely weird. This gets into like general closing questions and going towards my very first question to you. in this episode about like kind of what you're working on within water and music, just thinking through how to operationalize or how to think through building a generative AI strategy or workflow for a media company or for a research organization. This is kind of related to how probably the way that AI will have to be implemented at a lot of music companies is not going to start with music creation. It's going to start with all the activities around it. There's some parallel to water music in terms of kind of how at least you and I use like AI tools in our day to day. And I think it might be good to at least give people a preview of that. So you mentioned that you use Copilot every day. Do you use it daily basis at this point?
I mean, every time I touch code, I wouldn't say that's every day, but like a lot throughout the week.
Cool. In what specific ways has it changed your workflow? Has it just reduced the time to get to a certain endpoint? Or are there other ways that it's
It
changed?
depends on the program that you're writing because it's based off of the data set and what knowledge it has. So it has been useful for not having to like, it's like there's different layers, right? A lot of writing code, I feel like, I don't know how common knowledge this is, but it's actually not writing code. Like famously, like one of the early text editors that like programmers used is called V or Vim. And the concept is it's like notoriously difficult to like the first time you run it, like you don't even know how to exit the program. You're just like lost because its default mode isn't like any other text editor. It's built around navigation and like editing and not writing code. You have to like enter a different keyboard mode so that you can actually start inputting text. So a lot of programming is not just straight inputting text. It's manipulating code or like trying to edit mistakes you've made. And Copilot, some of it's auto correcting, like auto filling. It gives you a hint at like the best practices as far as like examples that it has in its data set. So if you're not familiar with, if you're starting to learn TypeScript or something like this augmented version of JavaScript, then like you might not know how to structure a specific thing, and like you just kind of start typing it, and it'll give you a pretty decent recommendation, and you can go with it, see if it works. That's versus like if you're trying to learn something, you'd have to go dig through documentation and ask a bunch of questions and like find somebody. It's actually been pretty helpful for me because like we're not part of a big company with a big dev team that has a lot of experience, where I have somebody that can just like reach out and ping. So having these other resources of information is pretty useful. And then ChatGPT actually is useful in like other areas because you can have it, you can query it instead of sifting through documentation. You can kind of go through that next level of like, all right, I want to build this specific thing. Like, what would that look like? And it can get you close if you're trying to build something that's like pretty commonly built. And then it'll recommend some parts of code. And I've gone, it's like, wait, explain why you're doing this. And it'll give really practical reasons. And it's a much quicker learning cycle for programming. Because programming can be difficult as far as you're constantly having to learn new things and integrate new things. It's not a very static thing unless you're like one of those OG Fortran developers, right? That's like getting paid buckets because you're like the only person who knows how to do it. Any of those like super old languages that like infrastructure is built off of. But yeah, so I mean that's as far as like how I've integrated it into my workflow. Some design decisions I've asked ChatGPT about. Is this a good idea, a bad idea? It's also this hasn't been directly like relevant to water music stuff, but just like personal exploration, understanding shaders. It's actually really good at shaders. Like I mentioned before earlier, graphics programming is very different and has like completely different paradigm as far as like how data is moved around and like how you manage state and like memory and even values that you're trying to reference later in the program. And so it's a decent learning hurdle to understand how to write shaders well. And so being able to go to a repository on Shadatory and like highlight code and be like, can you explain what's going on here? Super useful. And it's actually scary good. I think a lot of people are like trying to push ChatGPT. It's like, oh, can it generate code? It's like, oh, haha, it doesn't work. Let's prompt it better and also narrow the scope of what you're trying to ask. And it has enough information where it's still very valuable.
It's interesting to compare and contrast that to like how I use GPT in like my day-to-day, so I can maybe like walk through that and then can zoom out and give a preview of like how we're thinking of actually using it strategically like across water music as an organization, which is still very early on, but I think it'd be good to talk through ideas for that. Yeah, I do a lot with words, not so much with code, a lot with words day to day, a lot of writing emails, writing articles, editing articles, reading articles and papers, trying to summarize them, just general note taking, just like communicating and doing things with words being like the core of so many industries, especially in culture and media. GPT has not it's really helped me in like very specific functions of like writing and research that has saved some time. As of recording this, we're like on deadline to like finish copy for our season 3 report, and AI has been like very helpful in like getting to the like the last through the last mile on some things. For example, I am a very verbose and long-winded writer by default. You know this very well, Alex. If I had no restrictions to write an article, it would be 30,000 words long, probably. Involve lots of going down various rabbit holes, coming back, going down whole other tangents, coming back. Obviously, for like time-strapped music industry audience that just wants critical information to be smarter and do their jobs better. That's not the best combination. So I use it every day in whatever writing I do to like try to see if I can just communicate something a lot more clearly with a much stricter limitation on like word count or character count. We have a new starter pack series that is, I guess we launched it this year as part of the relaunch of the free tier for our newsletter. And each issue in that series breaks down a fundamental concept in music and tech and contextualizes those concepts against specific findings from our research projects. And so to put those issues together, I have to, as succinctly as possible in 200, 300 words, summarize the key findings from very long form research projects that we've released previously. And those issues would not exist without ChatGPT. So just, yeah, being very like willingly open about that. A more recent thing is that ChatGPT has actually helped me find language to articulate my own style. Something that we're trying to do in the coming months is like revamp our style guide internally at Water Music, especially because there are now so many people involved who are writing for us, and like me and the few other editors on staff can like verbally express like why we made a certain editing decision for a certain article. We can definitely do a better job at generalizing that feedback into a single document that we can give writers as they're working on an article, just to like better prep them for what's to come from the editing standpoint. And so I actually copied and pasted a newsletter that I wrote, and also that Young on our team wrote about AI, and like just copied and pasted it to ChatGPT and asked it to describe the style. And I've definitely planned on taking some of that output and like incorporating it into our style guide. Not to have it as like a substitute for how I'm thinking about like water music style at large, but to have it be just like an external brainstorming assistant. So to sum up that ramble and then turn it back to you to like talk through some ideas for how we're thinking of implementing this across the org. So GPT and like other tools around it. So there are a lot of like research specific tools, Explain paper, Symbiotic, which just came out in the last few weeks, I think, Metaphor.systems, Perplexity. The function for those is usually like allowing you to upload a document, usually a PDF, and like ask it specific questions. And it'll like just like in natural language, and it'll, spit out an answer for you with like decent accuracy. So how I use like the suite of tools that use GPT. So like ChatGPT, all those kind of research specific GPT powered tools is for like brainstorming ideas, which you can do much more efficiently than my currently limited brain can. Information synthesis, especially synthesizing like large swaths of research reports, white papers, interview transcripts. So synthesis and summarization. And then editing copy for tone. And a lot of like people in social media marketing already use GPT to like pretty powerful effect in this regard of like using GPT to like generate the same social copy across different platforms in just like record time, and like accounting for the voice differences of each platform. Like, can you edit this like brain dump that I wrote at 3 a.m., write it in like paragraph form in a way that has a more like professional and analytical tone and is speaking to an industry audience that is not as familiar with AI, for example. Like that's an example of a prompt that I've definitely used. So brainstorming, synthesis, and then editing for tone of voice. We're still early in like implementing that at a strategic level across the org, but it's something I would like to do to save a lot of time and just allow us to do better research at a lot of different stages of the process, especially at the brainstorming phase and at the editing phase. I'm curious what else comes to mind specifically for you, Alex, in terms of like ways, like, yeah, tools, prototypes that you're looking into building as well.
The tone of voice, I think, is doable. I'll have to see how doable as far as like building a tool where, hey, we have somebody wrote this and map it to Water and Music's voice. I think I know it's technically possible. I don't know if it's cost effectively possible and like what the process is to train it and all that. So that's more research I got to look into, but that's less existential. I think our main existential problem is more around synthesis slash, I would add context. We have a lot of information within our community, either structured through our past articles or in the conversations that happen in our Discord server. And being able to pull that information out, I think, is very critical to do soon. It's interesting how the same conversations will bubble up. And like people will be new to the community and like, hey, I have this idea. And it's not that we want to shut down the excitement, but it's like, yeah, we had this conversation a long time ago. And it'd be valuable for everyone if it was easier to surface those conversations and understand what's been discussed and like where the current state of that conversation is. There's actually work happening in academia around this by this guy named Joel Chan. He wrote this extension for this tool called Rome, which is like a note-taking editor, mind mapping thing. And they're trying to center his main thesis is that like academia is stalling right now because it's so hard to understand the information that is inside each one of these scientific papers. You read, you get a paper. It's like a 5-page PDF document that's like extremely dry, and the information's buried deep inside of it. You can read the abstract, get an idea of what's going on, but like the actual key nuggets of insight are like somewhere in this 2-column like tiny font thing that you have to get through. And so that process of trying to understand like what is known in the community at large is adding a lot of friction and is like slowing down progress. And so his tool was like trying to find a way where like people are annotating and like extracting that information, like being able to build a graph to where it's okay, here's the specific claims that we're trying to make in science, and here's all the supporting evidence, and it's referenced across all these different places. And so now with language models, I think that's a much more viable thing to build on like these smaller community level layers to where, all right, here's conversations we've had. We can extract information from those conversations and kind of have this space, one to, yeah, I guess there's multiple levels. One, to just make it easier to follow the conversations that are happening. And two, to also surface references to past topics that have been discussed. And so there's a more unified understanding of what's going on. Yeah, as far as how, it gets interesting because I've been kind of thinking about it like signal processing and like trying to adapt things that are known there to work. So like even just for making the right prompt to summarize a chunk of text, like right now there's a limit on how much text you can put into a GPT. I think it's 4,000 tokens or something. And like that 4,000 has to include the text you're putting in and the text you expect it to spit out. And it all has to fit into that like window. And so if you just chunk up your document straight up, you'll summarize a piece and it won't have the context of what happened before it. And so thinking through different ways of like how do you efficiently hold context as you're trying to summarize different chunks. And there's different techniques like using a sliding window to analyze the text versus splitting it up into discrete windows that don't overlap. I was inspired by how the like Hubble telescope works and like how those images, like beautiful images that you see from like James Webb and Hubble, those colors aren't actually real. They're artistic interpretations of a bunch of different wavelengths that's been processed and like each contain their own amount of information. And then they map that information to like the visible color spectrum that we can interpret. And so understanding that like text probably has a lot of information beyond like straight level that we're like, there's a bunch of different layers of information to text. And so having separate distinct passes of the text that are extract like one basic like extract name entities, extract sentiment, extract relationships between who's talking about what, extract different terms, like having different layers of processing for the same piece of text and then having some sort of abstract representation of the information in that. And then eventually that's synthesized down either into a summary or into a graph form where you can relate all these ideas together.
Got it. So fascinating. Yeah, to like the point of like context being the most existential thing. How do I break this down? Okay, I'll break it down with the water music example and like the music industry example. So yeah, with the water and music example, there are so many different forms of context that are just like living in people's heads. So like context on the history of the company mostly lives in my head, in the heads of maybe like longtime members, definitely most active Discord members who are like actively shaping that context in the sense of shaping conversation, and then contributors to our seasons, very tiny, like single digit percentage of the community as a whole. And then there's like industry context on different ways that people process information or behave or react or do deals in different markets with different kinds of companies or platforms that just lives in like everybody's heads, or a lot of it is like only communicated through like word of mouth or through negotiation, as you mentioned earlier, that's like not on paper. And so this goes to the industry example that you and I have debated a little bit about, which is like, can ChatGPT ever get to the point of writing out a good artist strategy? Because I think we tried a bunch of different prompts and the output was always very generic to me. I think like we had a specific prompt about, okay, I am Latin American underground experimental electronic artist who built a tight knit following on SoundCloud, and I'm about to release my debut EP or my debut album, and X number of months or period of time from releasing the album, I would like to get to sign a deal with X label because I think that's important for my current marketing goals, which is grow it to XYZ like audience size or something, or to reach these markets. But then if you give, even when we gave that context and asked ChatGPT what to do, the output was like very generic. Even after like iterating or asking it to expand on certain points, it like was not. It just felt like it was missing context. It was missing industry context that I knew was sitting in my head and was sitting in like the heads of Latin American music industry professionals that I like don't know if it sits anywhere in a way that like an AI would be able to sufficiently train on to output something that's actually helpful or unique in like a strategic sense. Do you think we'll get to the point where that changes, or is there maybe always going to be some kind of moat where say like a strategist can come in and be like, oh, I know AI can do XYZ in terms of generating ideas or content for me, but it can't touch this, and that's like where I will still have an advantage or still be like the main resource?
I remember specifically that example you're walking through. If you drill down and probe it enough, I think it did get to some interesting suggestions, but it required not just hoping that the first output or the second or third output was sufficient. It's like, all right, here's this 1 point out of 10 it was suggesting. Let's drill it down into that and like start having a very in-depth conversation about like how to execute on this one specific point. And I think it did give you some useful information, especially if we're going back to what I was talking about, like with AI doctors. Sure, it might not be the best in America, and there's better care to be had in America. But for people who have no fucking clue and have no access to those resources, it's way better than nothing, and it's way better than like traditionally what you would have access to. And so I thought it did give a decent, broad understanding of even just the things you should be thinking about. As far as context inside head, like this gets way more theoretical, and it's harder to. There might be a moat now and like in the future as long as that information isn't communicated anywhere in any way, right? Like eventually you're going to start communicating information over text, and if there's like a culture of like people wanting to make private databases that are augmented with these natural language models to where that pairing becomes like a tool and a reference and a bot that you can interact with, and I think that will happen, and eventually somebody's going to decide to like, hey, I'm the industry. I have all this knowledge. Let me productize that into this thing. That's like one level, is like very directly like trying to extract that knowledge from the industry professionals into these models. But then like on a more abstract level, it's like these concepts aren't new. They're not unique to the music industry as far as like negotiations and like how do you navigate like these different problems? One of the things that Joel Chan was exploring, I remember he had a really good podcast interview recently, is trying to map these problems and these concepts that come up in different industries. And like something that's explored in one fashion here can be mapped into the same problem space in a different area. And like understanding, like maybe one side has learned, yeah, actually, this is a general concept that happens in training AI, kind of on a meta level, is you don't have enough data in this one domain, but you have a lot of data in this other domain. And so you train up the AI in the one that you have enough data for, and then you fine tune it for the one that you don't. And so it's trying to transfer a lot of its knowledge between the two, and it works to varying degrees. So long term, even if that information doesn't disseminate, I think there will be systems built up to try and help people navigate it by referencing parallel problems in other industries that are more well documented.
Even independent of AI, that's like a problem the industry has. Like institutional memory is the song I will keep singing until I die. Institutional memory as like a high quality source slash input into AI models that can actually help with things like strategy, like having that info layer first is critical. Yeah. So we'll see if the industry gets to a point of like recording that information systematically, regardless of what happens with it on the tech side.
Meta
Yeah,
data.
yeah, let's go. Exactly. Dang. Okay. We definitely covered a lot of ground, both practical, very existential, very theoretical, but hopefully, if you're still listening, one, thank you. Hope this gave you a really interesting window and helpful window into how we structured our season, maybe gave you some ideas for how to start playing around with some of these tools yourselves. Hopefully, especially if you're looking to incorporate like AI strategically into your brand or to your company, some of our kind of long-winded thoughts have been helpful in terms of just offering potential frameworks to think about where it is or is not useful, at least right now. Alex, do you have any last parting thoughts or words to people listening? And also, if people are interested in diving more into any of the ideas that we talked about, where can they find you?
Yeah, I mean, DM's open on Twitter. What even is my handle? I think it's AJ Flores 1604. That's probably the easiest public way to reach me. Water and Music email is alex@waterandmusic.com, also available there. Parting wisdom. Yeah, I don't know. Things are changing so fast. I don't want to say try and keep up because it's a very daunting task for people. I almost want to say good luck.
No, I mean that could be encouraging to certain people. Something that I very much believe is true. I don't want to say every artist has to get on the bandwagon because yeah, there's like definitely a fault in taking that kind of like normative stance. I do think if you want to have an especially deep level of understanding of the tech and like also a say in how it evolves ethically and legally and be able to work directly with developers who are shaping the future of the landscape, there is no better time than now. The design space and like opportunities for experimentation are just so open right now, both in music and also in text. Probably like 6 months from now, there'll be kind of like more codified ways of doing things that will have stemmed out of the experimental work happening right now. So that's generally the feeling that I have and like why we chose this topic for season 3 and why I'm excited to like build within it myself as a writer slash editor slash strategist. I feel like now is like an especially ripe time to experiment because there's just so much flexibility.
Rewording what you said, I think we're establishing the cultural norms, and I feel like that's stronger than going in and trying to codify it in law. I'm thinking just programming and like trying to. We're actively building those up right now in the AI space, and so yeah, just joining that conversation and helping establish those, I think, is very valuable. Also, it's worth. It's not even advice, but I feel like just so that people aren't surprised, I think everyone's going to be wrong in two ways. One, in like things are going to change more than they expected, and then also there's some things that are going to stay the same more than they expected. And I feel like I'm not saying much with that, but I think it is worth pointing out that if you can figure out what those are, then that's kind of your edge. What is ready to be shifted and disrupted, and what actually people are saying is going to be disrupted, but you understand why it won't.
Thank you so much for your time. And yeah, feel free to reach out to either of us if you're listening, if you have any general feedback on the season or want to hear more about water music. We're definitely all ears. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye.